world after 1945 lay in ruins. Cities that once pulsed with life were reduced to rubble, streets lined with the remnants of lives abruptly interrupted. Smoke still lingered in the air, and the earth seemed tired of carrying the weight of human ambition. Amid the ruins, nations faced a desperate question: how could the world be rebuilt? And in this chaos, one country emerged almost unscathed: the United States. It held gold, oil, industry, and, perhaps most importantly, belief, a confidence in the future that the rest of the world had lost. Across the oceans, diplomats, economists, and leaders received urgent messages, letters carried across continents, summoning them to a place few had imagined: Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. In the quiet of snowy mountains and dense pine forests, a gathering unlike any other was taking shape. 44 nations, representing every continent scarred by war, sent delegates not with weapons, but with calculations, projections, and the weight of their people's hopes. They did not come merely to discuss trade or money. They came to design a system that could hold the world together, to write rules that might prevent the collapse of civilization as they knew it. The mountains witnessed a convergence of giants, men in tailored suits and women with resolute faces debated tirelessly, their voices rising and falling with the cadence of urgency. They spoke in different tongues, but the language was shared: survival, reconstruction, trust. Decisions that might seem mundane: the valuation of a currency, the establishment of new institutions, the exchange rate of gold to paper, carried consequences that would ripple across oceans and generations. In that conference room, the world's financial architecture was being redrawn with pencils and ledger books instead of treaties and battalion. At the center of these discussions was a subtle, shrewd offer from the United States. The dollar would be pegged to gold, a promise of stability in an uncertain world. Other currencies would peg themselves to the dollar, creating a lattice of interdependence where the green note became the anchor. It was an invitation bathed in both hope and constraint, a rescue for war-weary economies, but a leash tying nations to American influence. Each signature on the agreement was a quiet surrender of autonomy, a recognition that survival required participation in a system dominated by a single power. From this accord arose more than exchange rates. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank were born, institutions tasked with shepherding stability, lending confidence where it was most fragile. They were designed as guardians of growth, but also as instruments of influence. Beneath the veneer of global cooperation, the balance of power was shifting. Economic dependence became a subtle form of control. Nations could rebuild their cities, but they would do so within the orbit defined by Washington. The world's recovery came with a silent cost. Sovereignty, in its purest sense, had a new form of tether. The dollar, meanwhile, quietly assumed a symbolic reign. Each note bore the words, "In God we trust," yet it represented more than faith. It embodied authority, credibility, and the capacity to shape global markets. Every transaction, every trade settled in greenbacks reinforced the United States' newfound leverage. The world did not notice at first. Trade flowed, nations recovered, and hope blossomed in the shadow of ruin. But every shipment of goods, every loan disbursed, every currency conversion subtly reminded the world who set the rules. Power no longer marched with armies. It whispered through contracts, statements, and ledgers. By the 1960s, however, fissures began to appear. European allies, buoyed by post-war growth, started questioning the foundation of the dollar system. Did the United States truly hold enough gold to back the oceans of currency circulating worldwide? Doubt seeped into capitals and boardrooms. Bretton Woods, once a beacon of certainty, wavered under the weight of prosperity and excess. The promise of stability collided with reality. As economies grew, so did the exposure of America's balance sheets, and confidence began to fray. That tension erupted in 1971, when President Richard Nixon took a step that stunned the world. The dollar's connection to gold, the very linchpin of Bretton Woods, was severed. Shockwaves ran through global markets. Economies that had relied on the dollar's gold backing had to recalibrate instantly. Yet even in this rupture, the dollar endured. It did not vanish. It evolved. The United States discovered a new foundation for dominance, one tied not to metal, but to influence, commerce, and eventually energy. Petrodollars rose as oil agreements anchored global trade once again to the greenback. Nations around the world discovered that American currency was more than paper. It was a gateway to resources, investment, and geopolitical favor. Power, once explicit and martial, had become abstract yet absolute. The world bowed, not to force, but to liquidity. The dollar's second reign was quieter, yet no less commanding. Its authority flowed through pipelines, ports, and financial networks, shaping decisions in capitals thousands of miles away. Over the decades, the legacy of Bretton Woods became increasingly visible. Its framework guided the architecture of globalization, influenced crises and recoveries, and quietly dictated the tempo of commerce. Gold no longer ruled, but the principles etched in New Hampshire endured. Central institutions shared trust and dependence on the dollar. Influence had shifted from overt conquest to subtle orchestration. Nations could thrive or falter not by battles fought, but by the currency they held, the agreements they honored, and the markets they could access. History whispers lessons for those who listen. Stability is fragile and often engineered. True power resides in vision, adaptability, and the management of trust. Wealth is not simply dollars, bonds, or gold. It is the ability to navigate systems, to act decisively, and to understand the currents beneath apparent calm. The dollar's journey from gold-backed note to global benchmark illustrates that influence does not always roar. Sometimes it flows quietly, guiding the world in ways that few notice until decades later. The story of Bretton Woods is thus a human story as much as an economic one. It is a tale of survival, negotiation, and the relentless pursuit of order amidst chaos. It is the story of nations grasping for certainty, of leaders wielding power through subtle means, and of a currency that became a symbol of global trust. From rubble and ruin emerged a system that shaped the latter half of the 20th century, turning the dollar into a quiet king, commanding loyalty and shaping destinies without a single soldier deployed. And perhaps the most enduring lesson is this: time, wealth, and power are intertwined, fragile, and fleeting. Numbers on a page, contracts in a vault, or even armies in the field are only meaningful when paired with foresight, adaptability, and courage. History rewards those who act with understanding and punishes those who cling to illusions of permanence. The dollar may reign, empires may rise and fall, but the human capacity to perceive, adapt, and shape the world remains the truest form of wealth. In that delicate balance between action and patience, influence and humility, lies the story of Bretton Woods, a story of survival, sovereignty, and the quiet, enduring power of belief.